My name is Rachel, and for 8 years, I thought I had a good marriage. Not perfect, what marriage is, but solid. My husband Michael and I met in college, dated for 3 years, and got married in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by friends and family. We settled in Boston, built careers, bought a condo, and generally lived what I thought was a happy life together. Michael works in financial consulting, which has always required some travel. Over the years, I got used to him being gone for a few days every month, sometimes a week. It was just part of our routine. I had my own busy career in marketing, plus friends, hobbies, and volunteer work to keep me occupied when he was away. The first change I noticed was about 2 years ago. Michael's travel schedule suddenly increased. Where he used to be gone maybe 5 days a month, now it was closer to 10 or 12. He explained that his company had landed several new clients in the Chicago area and he needed to be there in person more often. It made sense. His career was advancing, the travel aligned with his company's growth, and he seemed to be the same attentive husband when he was home. If anything, he was more affectionate, bringing me thoughtful gifts from his trips and suggesting weekend getaways when he wasn't traveling. In hindsight, the guilt gifts should have been a red flag. But I trusted him completely. We'd been together for over a decade. We'd weathered job changes, family illnesses, and the general ups and downs of life together. Not once did I suspect he was capable of what I would eventually discover. The first real hint came about 6 months ago. Michael left his laptop open while he went to take a shower, and a notification popped up on his screen. It was an email confirmation for a dinner reservation at an upscale restaurant in Chicago for Mr. and Mrs. Carter. My first thought was that he must be taking a client and their spouse to dinner, though it seemed odd that the reservation wouldn't be under the company name. When I asked him about it later, he seemed momentarily flustered before explaining that it was indeed for clients, but he'd used our name because the restaurant prioritized returning customers. It didn't quite add up, but I let it go. Maybe I didn't want to see what was right in front of me. A few weeks later, I was looking for a document we needed for our taxes when I came across a receipt for a jewelry store in Chicago. It was for a pair of diamond earrings that cost more than $2,000, earrings I'd never received. It was dated 3 months earlier, around our anniversary. Michael had given me a beautiful bracelet for our anniversary, not earrings. The doubt crept in a little deeper, but still, I made excuses. Maybe they were for his mother's upcoming birthday. Maybe he bought them for me but changed his mind and got the bracelet instead. I wanted so badly to believe in him, in us. Then came the phone calls. Michael had always been protective of his phone, which I'd attributed to client confidentiality in his work, but now he started taking calls in another room, speaking in hushed tones. If I walked in, he'd quickly end the conversation or suddenly switch to discussing work details. One evening, after he'd returned from a 4-day trip to Chicago, I noticed him texting someone while smiling to himself. When he saw me watching, he quickly put the phone away. Later that night, I did something I'd never done before. I checked his phone while he was asleep. There were text messages from someone saved simply as C, with conversations that were clearly intimate and personal, references to their place and missing you and plans for the next visit. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would wake him. I wanted to shake him awake, to scream and demand answers, but some instinct told me to wait, to gather more information before confronting him. So I took pictures of the most damning messages with my own phone and put his back exactly where it had been. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day in a daze, alternating between crying and fuming with anger. How could he do this? Who was this C person? How long had it been going on? I had so many questions, but no answers. I considered hiring a private investigator, but wasn't sure I could afford one without Michael noticing the expense. Instead, I decided to do my own investigating. I started by searching through his things while he was at work, looking for any clue about who C might be. In the back of his closet, I found a small locked box I'd never seen before. It took me 2 days to find the key, hidden in an inside pocket of his rarely used winter coat. With shaking hands, I opened it, expecting to find love letters or perhaps more jewelry receipts. What I found was far worse. Inside the box was a stack of documents: a lease agreement for an apartment in Chicago under his name, recent bank statements from an account I didn't know existed, and, most devastatingly, a marriage certificate. Michael Carter and Catherine Wilson married 2 years ago in a small ceremony in Chicago. My Michael had another wife. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me, and I had to sit down on the floor, the evidence scattered around me. This wasn't just an affair, it was a double life, a whole other existence that he stepped into whenever he traveled for work. The marriage certificate explained the increased travel over the past 2 years. He wasn't going to Chicago more often for clients, he was going to be with his other wife, his other family. I wondered if she knew about me. Was she also being deceived, or was she a willing participant in this deception? Did they laugh together about naive Rachel in Boston, so trusting and oblivious? Once the initial shock wore off, I felt a cold, clear anger settle over me. I carefully returned everything to the box, locked it, and put the key back where I'd found it. Then I started planning. First, I needed more information about Catherine. The marriage certificate had her full name and birth date, which gave me enough to find her on social media. Catherine Wilson Carter, age 34, event planner in Chicago. Her profile was mostly private, but I could see her profile picture. A beautiful woman with dark hair smiling at the camera. Not at all what I expected. She looked kind, professional, normal. I spent the next week in a strange, detached state. I went to work, made dinner, slept beside my husband, all while knowing he had another wife in another city. I maintained the facade of normalcy while secretly gathering more information, taking photos of documents, and securing copies of our financial records. I also hired a lawyer, using money from my personal savings account that Michael didn't have access to. I explained the situation, showed the evidence I'd gathered, and asked about my options. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. In our state, bigamy is both illegal and grounds for an automatic annulment. Michael could face criminal charges. With my legal options clear, I now had to decide how to proceed. I could simply file for annulment, serve Michael with papers, and walk away. I could report him to the police for bigamy. Both options would eventually expose his double life, but somehow, they didn't feel satisfying enough. Then I found something else while going through Michael's carefully hidden paperwork, an invitation to a charity gala in Chicago happening the following weekend. Michael was listed as a sponsor alongside Mrs. Catherine Carter. He had told me he had an important client meeting in New York that weekend. That's when I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called my boss and arranged to take a few days off work. I booked a flight to Chicago and a hotel room near the venue where the gala would be held. Then I went shopping for a gown that would make sure I was noticed. The night of the gala, I arrived at the elegant hotel ballroom about an hour after the event started. I gave my name as Mrs. Carter to the check-in desk, saying my husband was already inside. The hostess smiled and waved me in without checking the list. The ballroom was crowded with people in formal attire, servers circulating with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I scanned the room, looking for Michael's familiar figure. It took a few minutes, but I finally spotted him near the bar, his arm around the waist of a woman in a midnight blue gown, Catherine looking even more beautiful in person. They were laughing together, clearly comfortable and happy, playing the part of the devoted husband with his lovely wife. My stomach turned at the sight, but I steeled myself and walked directly toward them. Michael saw me first. The color drained from his face and his arm dropped from Catherine's waist as if burned. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, which in a way he had, the ghost of the marriage he'd betrayed. "Rachel," he said, his voice barely audible over the music, "what are you doing here?" Catherine looked confused, glancing between Michael and me. "Michael, who is this?" I smiled my most pleasant smile and extended my hand to her. "Hello, Catherine. I'm Rachel Carter, Michael's wife from Boston. It's so nice to finally meet you." Catherine stared at my outstretched hand, then at Michael, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. "What is she talking about, Michael? What does she mean, wife?" Michael was frantically looking around, probably seeking an escape route. "I can explain," he said, though it wasn't clear which one of us he was addressing. "Please do," I said calmly. "I'm particularly interested in how you've managed to be married to both of us for the past 2 years. That must require quite the schedule." People nearby were starting to notice the tension, turning to watch the drama unfold. Michael lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. "Not here. We can't do this here." Catherine's face had hardened, her initial shock giving way to anger. "I think here is perfect, actually. I'd like to hear exactly what's going on." She turned to me. "How long have you been married?" 8 years this past June," I replied. "And you?" 2 years in April, she said, her voice shaking slightly. He told me he was divorced. Of course he did. I wasn't surprised, but it still hurt to hear the confirmation of his lies. Well, I can assure you he is not divorced. Very much married, in fact. We have a condo in Boston, joint bank accounts, the works. Michael looked like he might be sick. Please, he begged, can we go somewhere private to discuss this? I think we've had enough privacy, I said. That's how you've gotten away with this for so long? Catherine's eyes were welling with tears, but there was steel in her voice when she spoke. You've been living a double life? All this time? Everything you told me was a lie? Michael reached for her arm, but she jerked away from him. Kat, please. It's complicated. I love you both. Don't, she snapped. Don't you dare say you love me right now. A small crowd had gathered around us, whispering and watching. I recognized a few faces from the photos I'd seen on Catherine's social media, her friends, witnesses to her humiliation. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I think we've given everyone enough entertainment for one evening, I said. Catherine, I've left copies of relevant documents with the concierge for you. Marriage certificate, property records, bank statements, everything you need to verify what I'm telling you. She nodded stiffly, her composure admirable under the circumstances. Thank you. I appreciate that. Michael looked desperately between us. Rachel, Kat, please, let me explain. I'm not interested in explanations, I said. I've filed for an annulment. My lawyer will contact you. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Annulment? Not divorce? In our state, bigamy is grounds for annulment. It's as if the marriage never existed. I couldn't keep the bitter edge from my voice as I added, which, in a way, it didn't. At least not the marriage I thought I had. Bigamy, she repeated, the legal term seeming to drive home the reality of the situation. That's a crime, isn't it? Yes, it is. Michael paled even further. Rachel, you wouldn't… I haven't decided yet, I said honestly. That depends on how cooperative you are with the annulment. By now, the event organizers had noticed the disruption. A concerned-looking man in a tuxedo approached us. Is everything all right here? No, Catherine said before either of us could respond. Everything is not all right, but we're leaving. She turned to Michael with a glare that could have frozen fire. All of us. Now. The three of us walked out of the ballroom in tense silence, Michael between us like a prisoner being escorted by guards. Once in the lobby, Catherine turned to me. I have questions. Many questions. So do I admitted. But not with him present, she added, shooting a venomous look at Michael. I nodded in agreement. My hotel is 2 blocks from here. We could talk there. I'd like that. Michael looked panicked. You can't just… We can and we are, Catherine cut him off. You've had 2 years of controlling the narrative, Michael. Now it's our turn. And that's how I ended up spending the night talking with my husband's other wife in my hotel room, while he presumably returned alone to the apartment they shared. Catherine and I talked until sunrise, piecing together the elaborate web of lies Michael had constructed. For Chicago Catherine, he was a Boston native who traveled there for work and eventually decided to take a position that allowed him to move permanently to be with her, though of course he still had to travel to Boston regularly for work. For Boston Rachel, he was advancing in his career, taking on more responsibility that required regular travel to meet with clients. We compared notes on his habits, his stories, his inconsistencies. We laughed through tears at how skillfully he had manipulated us both, playing on Catherine's insecurities about her previous divorce and my trust based on our long history together. We marveled at the sheer audacity and effort it must have taken to maintain 2 separate lives for 2 years. By morning, we had formed an unlikely alliance. Catherine immediately filed for annulment in her state as well, and we both consulted with our respective lawyers about whether to pursue criminal charges for bigamy. In the end, we decided that the public humiliation and financial consequences of the dual annulments were punishment enough, though we made sure Michael knew that criminal charges remained an option if he didn't cooperate fully. It's been 6 months since that night at the gala. Both annulments have been finalized, and Michael has lost much more than his 2 wives. His employer fired him when the scandal came to light, concerned about having someone of such questionable character representing their firm. Many of our mutual friends have cut ties with him. His reputation, both personal and professional, is in tatters. As for Catherine and me, we've maintained contact, bound by our shared experience. We're not exactly friends. The circumstances of our connection are too painful for that. But we have a unique understanding of each other. We've both started rebuilding our lives, wiser and warier than before. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night wondering how I could have been so blind, how the man I loved could have betrayed me so completely. But then I remember the look on Michael's face when his two worlds collided in that ballroom, and I feel a grim satisfaction. He spent 2 years orchestrating an elaborate deception, but in the end, the truth found him anyway. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I say it's best served with an unexpected dinner guest, your husband's secret second wife.